What you see here is the logo of the Cognitive Science Society, which has been around since the 1980s. Around the outside it says linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, artificial intelligence, and education. I don't know if you would have guessed all those. Education in particular, you might not have guessed it. Over there is someone else's view of what the principal disciplines are. They leave out education, I see. Anthropology, it must be said, doesn't play nearly as big a role as it might. But what you can see is that we're dealing with something that doesn't know what it is. It's a weird mixture. The term cognitive science was coined in the 1970s by Christopher Longat Higgins. And the Cognitive Science Society was founded in the 80s. And to this day, cognitive science is not widely known. If you ask people what you're studying and you say cognitive science, they go, what's that? I get this all the time. I work as a cognitive scientist and it's kind of difficult. And people immediately say, don't you mean psychology? So one of the things we'll be doing is finding out why we need to have cognitive science as well as psychology, why we couldn't just have one horse to do this. But we'll also be sensitive to the fact that we're dealing with very many cultures, intellectual cultures. The intellectual culture, the world of anthropology is very different from the world of neuroscience, which is very different from the world of artificial intelligence and the many worlds of psychology. In many respects, cognitive science seeks to act as a bridge between these disciplines and to allow people to share insights and to arrive at insights maybe that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So we're going to trace the path that led to cognitive science over, we won't stop everywhere along the line. There will be big gaps, but we're going to go right back. We're going to follow more or less this course, going back to the ancient Greeks, of course, because you're in a university. Doesn't everything have to go back to the ancient Greeks? Everyone's writing a term essay. They always like to start with a quote from Aristotle to make them look brainy. And then we're going to skip 2,000 years and get up to Descartes. So that's bad. And then basically what we look at, we'll just get our bearings from the Greeks. Then we're going to look at the development of philosophy of mind. That's why Descartes, Hume, Locke, and Kant are in there. Then we're going to look at how the science of psychology arose, what its relationship to biology was, and that'll take us right up to the beginning of the 20th century. Then we're going to look at some developments in the middle of the 20th century in cybernetics and artificial intelligence and the language of information processing. And then we will constantly also encounter many contemporary strands, often listed under the name of embodiment, but also there are various words: ecological approaches, enactive approaches, embedded approaches. They all seem to begin with E. We'll mention neural networks or connections only in passing. So that's the path we're going to do. And what we're interested in is how all these various elements have contributed to the discussion of minds, brains, and behavior. Now, when I took over this course in the year, I've been running this since 2000, believe it or not. And there was a lot of publicity materials prepared by Ronan Riley, who's now the head of computer science in Maynooth, and they described what cognitive science was. I took one look at them and had to throw them all out. Cognitive science, as the program advertised itself 16 years ago, was the exploration of computational models of mind. It was the building and testing of computational models of mind. And I threw that out and I redefined it, because you get to do that, as the exploring the many relationships between minds, brains, and behavior, mainly because I wanted to open the sphere up to non-computational models, and also because, well, I don't know what the hell a mind is, so I don't know whether we have models of them. You see, if you get into the relationships between minds, brains, and behavior, you're already in difficult territory. Brains is the simplest one of those things. We know where they are. They're inside skulls. They're made of meat. They're not magic. We don't know how they work. We don't know what they're for. They're also, from a human perspective, probably the most complicated thing in the entire universe, but that's the simplest of the three things here. Behavior is more complicated, as we'll see when we get to speak of movement, because when you describe behavior, you become implicated in the description thereof. We describe behavior when we recognize some specific form of movement as being goal-directed. So if I scratch my face, you go, he's got an itch. But if I had a grand mal seizure, and my hand happened to do this, the movement would be the same, but you wouldn't say it was behavior. I wasn't behaving in any particular way. so that describing something as a behavior implicates me in its own description. That's where things get funky, because in cognitive science we are going to be dealing with the role of the observer as well as treating of things that we can observe in the world. And minds, God knows, when you get into minds, here we are. I think, and I think there's a strong argument to be made, that minds are essentially souls, more or less, as we treat of them. That is to say, the soul discourse became mind discourse, and we'll look at that historically, how that happened. But you're already, as you can see, into heated territory, and territory that doesn't lend itself easily to positivist scientific inquiry. So if I was to say we were going to do science of the soul or the spirit, you would all be legging it out of here as fast as you could run. You wouldn't trust me. That's right, you shouldn't trust me. Good. 10 years ago, if I'd said the same of consciousness, we would have got a similar reaction. Now we have a certain amount of science of consciousness. In fact, for the last 20 years, there's been an annual conference called Towards the Science of Consciousness, which for this year, for the first year, was the first conference on the science of consciousness. So they stopped being towards, which they've been for 20 years, and this year they are the science of consciousness. Intellect is a real problematic word. The notion of intelligence is a real problematic concept. It belongs in here somewhere. The anima would be more or less what the ancient Greeks, Aristotle in particular, would have assumed to more similar in many respects to the soul. When I'm pulling back to the ancient Greeks, I would like to go further and include a lot of Indian philosophy and possibly Chinese philosophy in here as well. We would there encounter concepts like Brahman and Atman, which are also in the same sphere and have also been articulated intellectually and empirically in very many ways. If you're more of a European philosophical sort of fan club, Heidegger's notion of Dasein is equally difficult to pin down, or does the pedestrian, entirely pedestrian, everyday notion of experience, your experience, my experience, no one could doubt that, could they? Do you have experience? Are you experiencing something right now? Well, that indubitableness that you are actually experiencing something right now is the reason that none of this goes away. And that word that is entirely pedestrian is also entirely mysterious, and is just as mysterious as all of these words. So mine's going to be a difficult one. We ask what cognition is. There's no good definition of cognition. In 2001, I was at a conference and we had over 100 cognitive scientists, and we passed around the sheet, and we asked people just to define cognition. We got over 50 definitions that were entirely non-unifiable. Nobody was agreeing. These were guys who live, guys and women, who live as cognitive scientists. Nobody could agree on what cognition is. So I'm not going to sort this out, but I will say that everyone seems to know that it's something to do about knowing. But we have to be careful there, and not to stick everything into one side of what is a relation. If there's knowing going on, then there's some knowing entity, and there's something that's known. So we have this relation already, the relationship between the knower and the known. Now, very often, that pans out as a relationship between a subject and a world. But it's a relation that we're talking about, and we can't simply assume either end of it is fixed. What world are we talking about, as well as what subject are we talking about? If we fix the world in one way, we may end up talking about one kind of subject. If we fix that notion of world in a different way, we may end up talking about a different kind of subject. Knowing is the subject of epistemology, and because this is, or strives to be, a science, I guess one way of approaching cognitive science is as practical epistemology. This relationship between subject and world, consideration of it, gives rise to some kinds of oppositions that keep coming back. And as we look at what it is to know or experience or be from various points of view, there are certain dichotomies that keep coming back, that we keep running into. And I've listed some of them here. We're going to be encountering these again and again and again, and we won't be sorting them out. What we will do is develop a sensitivity to them. We will know what's in play when we encounter this against that. Because for thousands of years, these oppositions have been the subject, they've been the engine driving all our thought about ourselves, whatever that means. We've got approaches which are eternalist, which seek to understand things as they always were and always will be. And we have approaches which emphasize processes of change or flux. That's where we're going to start with the Greeks. So the eternalist position tries to say what things are at a given time. Questions of time are going to be very big here. And the dynamic position emphasizes what comes into being, how are things brought forth. Language is a little bit more difficult here. Then when we get into philosophy of mind, we'll find a different kind of an opposition, but again, one that we shouldn't take too seriously, but it serves to lay out a landscape. The concerns of the rationalists, who emphasize the role of human reason, and the empiricists, who emphasize our grounding through our senses in a world in which we experience things. These are different approaches to knowledge, and we'll find representatives of each. And we won't, this is not football, we won't be rooting for Man City or Man United. We'll be trying to understand the concerns of both parts. After we've gone through a lot of philosophy of mind, we'll end up with positions, well-articulated positions, so you can identify where someone stands in a landscape. And one important question is, what's their relationship to the vexed notion of representation? As we'll see, representationalist accounts frequently try to ground meaning in some sort of mediation. For example, mediation through the senses. Anti-representationalists tend to try to emphasize the way in which one is already in the world and not separate from the world. These are long-standing tensions, and the answer is not, oh, the answer is representations, or the answer is not representations. It is important to understand what these distinctions are. And these are huge, huge questions. I confess, I've been doing cognitive science now for 30 years, and for probably 20 of those years, I did think the question of representation was something that would be sorted out scientifically. I no longer believe that. I think it's theological. It depends on the debate we're having. The representation questions, anyway, are very, very big and don't only relate to patterns of nervous firing, as we see. Doors open there. I did say that the theme of social cognition is going to be really, really big. If we speak of relationship between minds, brains, and behavior, it sounds like we're dealing with individual elements, individual subjects, the psychological subject, the person. And that's true, and that gets you so far, and that there's a lot of our lives, a lot of our concerns that does not work for. So we need to know what are the advantages and disadvantages of taking such a stance. Are we condemned to such a stance? And how do we acknowledge the various collectivities within which we live? That's going to be fun. And then there's lots of, you can do metaphysics here as well. Is there one kind of thing? Are subjects distinct from worlds? Are minds different from, should we speak of mental physical dichotomies? Or should we just be pragmatic? Or admit all kinds of things? I don't know. But these are the kinds of issues that have been recurring in the various traditions for at least 2,500 years, and they're not going anywhere. They will still be on my slides next year. Okay, we won't have sorted this one out. We're a bit like these guys. This is Raphael's School of Athens. Magnificent work. This is Aristotle and Plato in the middle. We're not going to talk a lot about Aristotle and Plato. They're the main Greeks. This here, in the likeness of Michelangelo, is Heraclitus of Ephesus, the weeping philosopher. And this here is Parmenides. And both of these are actually before these guys and before that Socrates there. They're also before Socrates. They're what we're called PreSocratic philosophers. This is the earliest that we have in the Hellenistic tradition of philosophy. And like I said, the Indian tradition goes back a little further. And they're related as well. There's lots of influence between Indian and Greek philosophy. But it's here that we start, and we're not going to deal with their ideas in any principled or reasonable fashion. It's too long ago. We don't know what the hell they were talking about. Their works are almost all lost, and they wrote poems, for God's sake. Right? And they're nearly all lost. But these two in particular, Heraclitus and Parmenides, are wonderful landmarks. So that as the course goes on, again and again, we'll find ourselves saying, that's a Heraclitean sort of approach. That reminds me of Parmenides. Because they're orthogonal. They have completely different approaches to answering fundamental questions. And the kind of questions that they're both addressing are questions of existence. What does it mean to say something exists? How is that related to the notion of time and the present? These are deep questions. We're never going to get away from them. What is it to be the same thing through time, to persist through time? And what's the relationship between the world as it appears to us, in experience, if you will, and its own nature, if it has such a nature? These are big, big questions, and they take very different approaches, and these very different approaches are going to be useful to us. Parmenides here, we can equate with an eternalist and deterministic view. If you want to cast Parmenides' view of nature into a modern vocabulary, imagine a four-dimensional block of space-time. That hard to do? Can you imagine a four-dimensional block of space-time? Can you imagine? Okay, well, let's reduce space to 2 dimensions instead, so we can make the whole thing 3-dimensional, so we can put it on the table. Okay? I mean, squashing us down to 2 dimensions isn't hard. You know about flatland, right? You can start to develop your intuitions here. So if we have a big block, and at any given slice, that's everything that happens at time t. And there's everything that happens at time t plus 1. Most scientific accounts are couched in this frame. They describe the goings-on in a block of space-time. Actually, since relativity theory, this is not quite that simple. But the important thing is that in such a view, it's an entirely familiar view. We speak of causes followed by effects. We speak of progression from a big bang to a big crunch. We identify ourselves as now, here, at a particular point on this scale. The funny thing about this view, this way of laying out things, is that there is no notion of now. Each slice, no slice is privileged. Nothing flows, and any laws that you can express in this formalism can be run backwards as well as forwards. Physicists have long struggled with this. It's a great way of describing processes of change and of causation, but it is incapable, in principle, of addressing the notion of now, and you can't really treat of experience of a living being without the notion of now, for we live in that now. What time is it for a living being? It is always now for a living being. So these are good, fun questions. Heraclitus lives in the now. He's the guy who gave us this notion that everything is changing, panthere, all this flux. He's the guy who said you never step into the same river twice. So he starts with the now, and he tries to understand what it is to persist, to come into being and go out of being. It's a non-deterministic view, and it's simply not the case that these are competing views. They are radically different ways of coming at issues of existence and being. I would be very unhappy if we were to conflate this to say that this is a subjective view and this is an objective view. That would not please me at all. Those words are going to need an awful lot more unpacking, subjective and objective, because we are dealing with subjects in cognitive science. The subject is our main theme, the subject and the world of the subject. But these are useful landmarks, because when we're dealing with Heraclitus, we're dealing with processes of change coming into being. This is where Heidegger lives, for example. When we're dealing with Parmenides, we're dealing with state-based accounts and strong deterministic mathematical models. Now, their works are almost all gone. We know very little of their actual philosophy, so I'm freely riffing on these ancient Greek philosophers because that's what they're good for. Right? They'll serve for us as landmarks because we'll need to keep coming back. So now we're just going to skip forward 2,000 years. That was about, 400 or 500 years BC, and now we're going to skip up to the 16th century, and the guy with the best hair in the history of philosophy. And everybody knows Descartes. I'm going to assume everybody knows Descartes. Descartes was a bleeding genius. His philosophy reads extremely well, even in translation. You can read Descartes now, and he's far easier to read than most 20th century philosophers. He makes sense. He was a Catholic, which is extremely important in his philosophy, although we tend to secularize him. But you can't really understand Descartes unless you understand his view with respect to God and the soul. And he is going to, much like Parmenides and Heraclitus, he's going to represent an extreme position, and one which is unfair to attribute to him because he is nuanced and broad and has a lot going on. But he's going to become for us the arch rationalist, the man who believes in human reason. He believed that the proper route to knowledge was through the action of the mind, and the mind was most at home in matters of logic and reason. And if you stray away from them, if you get into dreams, hopes, ambitions, imaginings, opium fog, then you're more likely to make mistakes, to drift into error, which is fine. He's best known for his skeptical inquiry. He was a skeptic. He wanted to find out what kind of knowledge could really be trusted. The rationalist wants to build a house on a rock, wants to have some foundation for knowledge. And Descartes is also a human being, so he knows he's been drunk, he's been asleep, he's dreamt, he's had hallucinations, he's seen optical illusions. He knows you can't always believe what you see. He knows, funny, when you think of it that way, it's odd how much seeing comes to stand for experiencing. This is something that we're going to run into again and again. When we talk, you can't trust your senses because seeing is believing. We often speak of seeing as if that was what we were really doing. But anyway, he knows that the senses can be fooled, and so he appeals to an introspective withdrawal, as it were. I like to imagine him hiding underneath the table somewhere with a blindfold on, his fingers in his ears. I don't think that's how he did his philosophy. Now, he wanted to establish a foundation for what he called true and certain knowledge. And he knows that the senses can be deceived. And this is the most famous bit of the second meditation. After considering everything very thoroughly, that's a strong claim right there, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, je suis, j'existe, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. That's not, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. It's je suis, j'existe, and it's in French, not in Latin or English, and I'm going to claim that's important. But this gifted us a stonker of a problem, the cogito. This I am, this I, that is indubitable, doesn't go away. This becomes the bridge as we traverse from older notions of the soul to modern notions of the mind. The cogito sits in there. Nobody can display, we haven't managed to displace it appropriately yet. Nobody believes in the cogito. In fact, Descartes' metaphysics are rotten. He distinguishes between res cogitans and res extensa. Between res cogitans is the mental, res extensa is the stuff of material stuff, the stuff that is extended in space. The mind is not extended in space. That generates well-known problems, and these problems have been recognized. The Greeks knew about these problems, the Indians know about these problems, and he gets these problems as well. If you think like that, this is one particular form of dualism. If you think that the mental is separate from and distinguishable from the physical, you've got a big problem. How can mental stuff influence physical stuff? Because influence seems to be mediated by contact in most cases. Where is that point of contact between the mental and the physical? Well, Descartes didn't know either, but there was a bit of the brain going and begging. The little gland, actually, it's not nervous system tissue, it's the pineal gland, and he said, that's the bit. He was wrong. The pineal gland is really, really important. It is important in a way that is eerily reminiscent of the role that Descartes wanted to give it, in that it's important for getting over jet lag, for remaining locked to the rhythms of the world around you, your circadian rhythms tied to the passage of day and night, those kind of hormonal systems within your body that keep you rhythmically engaged with the world, coupled to the world. That is what the pineal gland does, and I find it eerily reminiscent of what Descartes wanted to do. But nobody believes Descartes' metaphysics. You can't have a realm of the mental that exists somehow independently of the realm of the physical and still have one influence the other. And if you can't have that, then you can't account for how I can do something like pick this up, because the mental business of desiring, wanting, intending to pick this up leads to the obviously demonstrably physical movement of my hand and the remote control. There's lots and lots of ways you can approach this. If you think of the mental and the physical as separate, which, now as I said, nobody buys his metaphysics now, but back in the 16th century, Everyone thought of souls as distinct from matter. And Descartes is talking, he's not distinguishing between soul and mind here. And so there's a lot of non-solutions, but that have been tried out by various people. So you've got interactionist solutions, whereby something physical causes something mental, and that something mental causes something physical in a kind of a ping pong. But then it's hard to make that work. You've got this position, epiphenomenalism, which is that what's real is what you observe and the material goings on in the world, and your belief that you're actually influencing things is nonsense. Strong forms of Calvinist predestination would tend in this way to believe that your belief that you're actually influencing things is really rather tragic. You're just a spectator to your own life. No one really likes that. That's epiphenomenalism. Possibly the most used non-solution here is psychophysic parallelism, where yes, you've got physical events going along, following physical rules, behaving in accordance with physical law. You've got mental events which follow their own causal sequence, and they keep in lockstep through the magic of a third agent, which is God. So it's not a great solution either. Nobody really likes it. Now, one thing that underlies this sort of problem area is the view of the material world as being complete, as existing in its own right, subject to natural law, and entirely mindless. For Descartes, this wasn't something you could question. The body, for Descartes, was a machine. It was a machine that was driven somehow. It's useful to bear historical sequence in mind. Descartes comes just before Newton. Newton has Cartesian mathematics available to him and Cartesian insights available to him. But these ideas are in the air, and around this time, the basic understanding of those who were good at physics and maths and stuff was that bodies were machines which were driven, and you needed some laws of mechanics, some mechanical principles. And along came Isaac Newton, and he provided this. Isaac Newton gave us a magnificent account of mechanical motion. That is the motion of inanimate things under idealized circumstances. And this really was the first strong mathematical statement of what we now call natural law. Newton's work was huge, and it became the foundation stone for something that we call the Enlightenment. We just don't have time to do everything in this course. There's lots to do there. And it bothers me somehow that today I frequently see papers written in the sphere of cognitive psychology or cognitive science where the abstract of the paper reads like this. People do this weird and surprising thing. The mechanism by which this is achieved is unknown. As if it were assumed that because you observed something, there was a mechanism behind it. When people do that, they're speaking the language of the 17th century, and they ought to be careful. Mechanics is no longer the state of play in physics. It no longer is our best account of the world. It's the best system we have for accounting for the motion of inanimate, rigid matter, rigid bodies, at spatial and time scales appropriate to the human body. And this is kind of weird. So the mechanical picture delivered to us by Newton that works so well, still the basis for an awful lot of the science that allows us to throw lumps of metal at Mars and hit and call home. That wonderful framework is actually body-centered. But to go beyond the Newtonian accounts, you need to make measurements that are very far removed from the time scales and spatial scales with which you encounter reality. So your body is a certain size, and because of that, you say that something is big or small. There's no such thing as something which is big in itself. A galaxy is not big and an atom is not small. It can only be big or small with reference to something. And intuitively, we use our body as a reference. We think of the atomic domain as small because we're bigger. We think of galaxies as bigger because we're smaller. We also live at a specific time scale, which ultimately is derived from our biological embodied being in the processes of metabolism. We use high-speed photography and time-lapse photography to draw things into a temporal realm where we can perceive them, to draw events into that realm. Just in the same way that we use magnifying glasses and telescopes to make things visible that are too big or too small to be seen, or too distant. This Newtonian account thus has a mysterious tie to the body. It's peculiarly effective at describing the world when things are about the size of a bread box or an apple. It doesn't account at all for any animate motion. There is no account in the Newtonian framework for anything that's volitional, any biological motion, any of the goings-on of the living, which is odd because we live in a world built by the living, for the living. We live in the biosphere. And Newtonian physics has absolutely nothing to say about that. So the appeal to mechanistic explanation is something that one ought to be cautious about. There's good reasons for having, mechanical explanations are great. If I can provide you with a convincing mechanical explanation, you'll feel that you've kind of understood something. At least you'll have some mastery to predict something. But it's metaphysically troubling to think that human behavior needs mechanistic explanations. By no means obvious. So we have this big question as to what role mechanics ought to play. I'm using the word mechanics in a technical sense. That means following laws of motion, the three Newtonian laws of motion. Equal and opposite reaction, the body in motion tends to remain in motion, to have forces, mass times acceleration. Those laws can account for the motion of inanimate bodies, but we often think of that as physical motion, but we need to interrogate what we mean by physical. If we're not going to jump to a simple distinction between res extensa and res cogitans, then we do need to develop some sensitivity to how we're using our vocabulary as we talk about these things. What can a mechanistic account deal with, and what are its limitations? All too often, we encounter a reliance on these kind of dualities or oppositions. Now you can see it's already coming through. These dualisms that have infused the consideration of our own being for thousands of years are already center stage. When we encounter something like mental physical, even today in sophisticated philosophical discourse, we find an ignorant reliance on the physical as if it were simple, and as if the mental were the difficult stuff that we need to shoehorn in there somehow. When you find yourself wondering, how do brains generate consciousness? Because that's a kind of a weird thing to generate. You know, I've got machines at home that generate kale juice, and you can make things that make things, but nobody knows how to make consciousness, and we don't even, it's like, is it some kind of yellow stuff exuded by nervous? It's difficult to know how brains make consciousness, but that's to assume that the brain, the physical object, is somehow generating something that belongs in another realm. It's to bring back this Cartesian problem. The distinction between minds and brains, or between the mental and physical, is not a simple discussion, and it's not the case that the brain or the physical is simply given, and it's the other stuff, the mind or the mental, that we have to worry about. By articulating something as the realm of the physical, we've already set up our opposition. It's also worth noting that not all languages support these, and that the meaning of these, of all the vocabulary in this area, changes over time. As I pointed out, what was now souls, what was once souls became the cogito, becomes minds. And that space is much more fluid than I'm letting on here. So it's worth noting that especially when you get to these hard table-thumping arguments about what's definitely real, what's indubitable, it's worth remembering that a lot of the language that you use is determined by the culture and the time that you live in. And I want to illustrate this kind of dramatically. When we speak of physical proof, physical kickable proof, what are we looking for? So Bishop Berkeley, famously the Irish philosopher, was an idealist. To be is to be perceived. He's the guy who thought that the world only exists as long as it is being perceived. Happily, the reason it persists when no person is perceiving it is because God is looking over the whole thing. But Samuel Johnson was a notoriously hard-headed lexicographer, didn't like this idea at all. He said, he was asked, how would you refute it? And he famously said, I refute it thus, and he kicked the stone. Using the kickability of the stone to show that's nonsense, it's not all ideas. Look, I'm kicking the stone. And that reminds me of another character here, which is Doubting Thomas. This is Doubting Thomas. This is the resurrected Jesus in the Caravaggio painting. And he wanted proof. He was a skeptic in many ways, like Descartes. He'd heard of the risen Jesus, and he wasn't really tremendously impressed by that. He wanted to know for himself, to see for himself, and actually to put his finger in and squish it around and feel the sound, the warmth, and the smell. Blood, yep. So the senses are clearly involved here. The kind of proof he's looking for is available only to an experiencing subject who can actively engage with something, volitionally engage. That's a very, very strange notion of physical in a way, but it's part of what we mean by physical, right? And it turns out we mean lots of things by physical. Here, the best place to go to find out what something means is to ask Twitter. Of course, but it's physically impossible for me to pay attention during class. I love Bambi here. I physically cannot sleep with pants on. I am physically hurting, oh my God. It's physically impossible to say no to. Do you ever say physically sick? Physics is an odd discipline, isn't it? It makes you keep your pants on, makes you sick. Physical disgust, physical sickness. Everything here speaks to me of experience. Nothing speaks of the stuff of measurement. Right? So we use physical to mean the indubitable. And in a way, we're coming back. Remember that big list of words like soul and mind and Atman and Dasein? At the bottom was the pedestrian word experience. It is deeply mysterious and hard to talk about. So, we've had Descartes. We've got all these problems about the mental and the physical. It's time for a joke. Irishman, Scotsman, and an Englishman walk into a bar. John Locke is an Englishman, Bishop Arthur is an Irishman, David Hume is a Scotsman. Together they're the British empiricists. Right? I don't have a punchline for that, but if anyone can make up a joke along those lines, I could really use it in my lectures. And they, at this important period in time, they represented a philosophical strand that took a principled opposition to the assumptions of the rationalists. The rationalists assumed all kinds of stuff built into the human mind so that you could make sense of the confusing information provided by your senses to arrive at a clear and distinct impression of what was actually the case. These guys saw all knowledge as grounded in the senses. To them, you are never desensate. You come into the world, you grow from a small biological starting point, and what you learn comes through your engagement with the world, comes through the senses. And yes, they had problems with figuring out how you go beyond that, how you arrive at the notion of a universal rather than a particular, how you arrive at the conceptual from the perceptual. There's all these well-known problems that arise there. And they took different approaches to it. David Hume is the most important of these from our point of view. Locke and Berkeley are very important for many reasons. But Hume can stand against Descartes in many respects as showing how knowledge is grounded in the senses. Hume is also quite remarkable in that he was something of a closet atheist. He didn't publish some of his writings because he would have got into trouble. He actually he was refused academic positions because his writing was seen as suspect. And in fact, some of his insights have possibly been influenced by Buddhism, Buddhist notions of no self or no mind, which is a really interesting connection. He's quite remarkable in this context because everyone else we're going to look at is rooted firmly in Christian theology. Hume doesn't know what his self is. Looks inside, he doesn't have this sense of je suis, j'existe. But he does emphasize how all knowledge everything that you experience comes through the senses, and that anything you know must therefore be grounded in this way. The role of experience in your understanding of the world was crystallized in a very famous question which was posed to John Locke over there. It's known as Molyneux's question. This is the actual text of the letter sent to Locke. Suppose a man born blind and now adult, and taught by his touch to distinguish between a cube and a sphere of the same metal, and neither of the same bigness, so as to tell when he felt one and the other which is the cube and which is the sphere. Suppose then the cube and the sphere are placed on a table and the blind man be made to see. The question is whether by his sight, before he touched them, he could now distinguish and tell which is the globe, that's the sphere, and which is the cube. So we've got this person, it's a thought experiment. We've got this person who's blind, who's learned to distinguish these using their hands. You put them on a table, you magically restore his sight. Can he now tell the difference just by looking? What's the answer? Anybody have an intuition? Does anyone think definitely? You think definitely? I think definitely. Anyone think no? Well, it's a great thought experiment. It was posed back in the 17th century, or 17th or 18th century, I'm not sure the year of it. And it's the kind of thing that you can actually do some empirical study on. That is, there have been cases in the meantime of people whose sight is restored at various times under various conditions. And with clinical cases, you're always dealing with a lot more than the pristine elements, minimalist elements of a thought experiment. But there has been a lot of discussion about this since then. And the general consensus is the answer is no. That you have to actually wield your sight in order to understand it. It takes a couple of days. So cases of mainly cataract removal, where someone who's congenitally blind, suddenly allowed to see, and it takes them a couple of days to learn to wield vision, to be able to distinguish the near from the far, or to know the correspondence between what formerly you knew as an edge with what you're seeing as a visual discontinuity. We'll see some animal work. Well, actually, in this class, I'm not sure. We will. We'll see some theories of vision that emphasize that vision is an activity. It's a skilled activity, and it's something that you therefore need time to learn. But it's been, rather than jumping to the answer and saying the answer is no, it's obviously more complicated than that. But the beauty is that this is a very well directed question, which served to improve our discussions around such issues for several hundred years and continues to do so. So now we've got this dichotomy here. We've got, again, it's not Man United against Manchester City. We've got we've got a landscape in which we can identify concerns that ultimately will have to get along with each other. In the rationalist camp, we're concerned with the nature, if any, of innate knowledge. Where does that come from? These days we would look to biology and genetic inheritance and such like for answers there, stuff that wasn't available to Descartes, of course. Rationalists valorize reason and deduction, and the power of humans to reason is something that has fiercely impressed very many philosophers. We may touch on reasoning. We're not such great reasoners, actually. Some people see reasoning as being that which makes humans human. Language is the other thing. Language and reason, of course, go closely together. Rationalists emphasize the need for certain knowledge. And what do you bring with you as you encounter a new situation? You bring a lot of built-in knowledge, a priori knowledge. The empiricists, Locke in particular, opines that the newborn baby was like a blank slate, a tabula rasa, on which experience would write. Knowledge acquisition here is a process of inference and induction from particulars to generals. And all knowledge is ultimately, because it's grounded on experience, it's capable of being revised. So the absolute certainty that Descartes wanted, and which hangs together very seriously with his theology, is not available from a strongly empirical standpoint, and you learn after the fact. You're informed by experience. Presenting this in this way emphasizes the polarities involved emphasizes these dualities, the distinction between the physical and the mental, and the problematic nature of the cogito. The cogito assumes to be this thing that's within you that somehow knows stuff, or that is you from an experiential point of view, brings all kinds of problems with it. We'll take a 5-minute break there. It's a 2-hour lecture, like just a toilet break or whatever you like. And we'll pick up with Immanuel Kant, who tried to make some sense of this. I'm not sure he worked. So.